Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's edition of the Rose and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chavla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Pranella Rosa. This week, we're talking about Israel-Hezbollah exchanges and how it reopens the risk of a further extension to the conflict. I mean, this is effectively something that's been going on for many years, if not decades, but has really sprung up in the aftermath of the October 7th attack on Israel last year. The 1 year anniversary of which we're quickly approaching. It's been a terrible humanitarian catastrophe. But from a political risk angle, what the world has always been watching for is how this blows up to, from being a war within Gaza to becoming a much larger regional escalation. And last week, there's a series of military exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon that might, potentially open up the risk of this. Brunello, could you just start by telling us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so as you correctly said, this situation has been going on for decades. And as far as I can remember, there has been tensions in that particular part of the region between Israel and Lebanon. But last week there was an intensification um, with Israel making kind of intense airstrikes on the southern part of Lebanon just to attack some Hezbollah position that, according to their own sources, were ready to launch uh, their own missiles onto Israel. So it was a sort of preemptive attack. Now, like all these things, it's very hard to understand who's starting, who's first, who's second, who's reacting versus who's attacking. Point is, there are massive tensions. That we know that there are um, military exchanges going on in the region, and so we shouldn't be surprised completely out of these. What the Lebanese would say is that they wanted probably to vindicate the assassination of Faoud Sukur, which occurred at the end of July in Beirut. And Sukur wasn't just any other guy, he was one of the Hezbollah founding generation and has been a major advisor to the supreme leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. Now, this assassination actually occurred 1 day before, on July 31st, of the other high-profile assassination of this period of Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas that was killed in Tehran. And again, this is just to remind ourselves, if it was needed, that um, um, there's a role that Iran is playing in all this, although behind the scene, through his proxies in the region, and Hezbollah is clearly one of them. And so, even if the direct confrontation between Israel and Iran has been kept to a sort of minimum, although it has occurred, as we know, and we fear there might be more, Iran continues to use its own proxies in the region, including, of course, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis, and you name it. So this has been the worst exchange between the two countries since 2006, when there was a 34 days war between the two. It's hard to define a country. Israel is a country. Hezbollah is a political slash military faction, as Hamas is, and clearly this is the background of what we are discussing today.
Yeah. And then in the newsletter, you point out three other sort of directions of possible, this risky situation blowing up. And first, there's the increased risk of regionalization of the conflict. Tell me more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, so the point is, there are always these tensions, and they are not going to abate anytime soon, and especially until the war in Gaza is ongoing. And unfortunately, we don't see this ceasing anytime soon. But the question is, can this escalate further? And if so, in what direction? We believe there are three uh, direction. The first one, the one you mentioned, is the regionalization of the attack, which means that instead of remaining a war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, other parts of the Israeli Palestinian territory are involved, or other countries. And first and foremost, the neighboring countries, including Lebanon. And every time that there are those kind of military exchanges, there's a fear that this regionalization of the conflict may resurface. And let's not forget, there are ongoing conflicts throughout the region. We know about Gaza, but we know that the Houthis are continue to send the rockets on the foreign ships crossing the Red Sea. There's Lebanon, we just discussed, and there are operations throughout the region whereby countries try to position themselves against this conflict. Now, Israel key ministers of foreign minister and defense minister Katz and Gallant, respectively, have said that they don't want a regionalization of the conflict. They don't want a further expansion. They want this to remain confined to Gaza. But every time there are those kind of events and episodes, the risk that it will escalate further to a regional level exists.
Yeah. And this also has implications for the world, not just kind of what's happening in the region. You point out about the risk of terrorist attacks in Europe, which we've seen an uptick of recently. Tell me more about the connection here.
Yeah, that's the point. The war in the Middle East throughout history has always been an excuse for other things to happen somewhere else, in particular terrorism. We remember at the very beginning how the Palestinians used to conduct terrorist operations in the 70s, the 80s, just to be recognized as a political, so to speak, actor, somebody that needed to be taken seriously. And this has continued until today. Now, because, Islamic extremists or other kind of extremists from the other faction, they could be Israeli extremists and so on, always take this as an excuse. They want to vindicate something that has happened the day before, the week before, the month before, somebody of particularly high standing that was killed in some kind of operation. Is always an excuse to combat some form of high-level terrorist attack. Now, more recently, we saw in Solingen in Germany at the summer festival, few people were killed, many others were wounded by an ISIS extremist who, shouting the usual chants, conducted his terrorist attack. And this was, people could say, a reaction to the brutality of the German police that was used against the pro-Palestinian peaceful protesters or demonstrators of the last few weeks. So again, we arrive at a point in which it's very hard to say who's first, who's second, who's reacting, who's attacking. It becomes a sequence of events that is very hard to unwind.
Yeah. And the number one global event that people are watching out for is happening in the United States later this year, the sort of very contested US election in early November. I'm sure this conflict has implications in particular for that. Could you tell us a bit more about how this might shape the race for the next American president?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, as we know, there are ongoing negotiations to try to negotiate a ceasefire between Israel, IDF, and Hamas in exchange for a return of the hostages and so on. But these negotiations, they're not ongoing in Cairo. They see the participation of Egypt, of course, that is the host nation, and then Qatar, that tends to be involved in all these kind of negotiation, and of course the US. Unfortunately, I don't think any of this is working so far, and I don't think it will work for a few more months. In fact, I don't think any of this will work until the next president is elected, and it will be clear what direction the US will take. Why is that so relevant? Well, first, we saw that this conflict is highly dividing for public opinions. There have been lots of protests and demonstrations in universities and so on, and the police had to intervene and react again, also in the US, because the war is always a dividing feature, and this particular war has been even more dividing than others. Secondly, war tends to be more dividing in the Democratic camp rather than the Republican camp, because the Democratic camp tend to have its own pacifist faction that tends to have a huge bearing. And therefore, if you were to have a division within the Democratic Party on this particular theme, that will make the attempt by Kamala Harris to win the election in November almost mission impossible, which is exactly the reason why both herself and President Biden are trying to close this deal by the presidential elections so that they can flag a success in foreign policies. But that's exactly the reason why I don't think this is going to happen. So this war will remain highly consequential at regional level, at international level. For the US elections, people will continue watching these things. Let's not forget that the Jewish community is a huge constituency in the US electoral campaign for various reasons, and therefore, again, there's a difficult equilibrium and balance that needs to be the president needs to strike between supporting Israel while at the same time preventing Israel from exceeding in the way he conducts his war. So, very hard to navigate these waters for anybody, and in particular for presidents during an electoral campaign.
Yeah. And it's interesting just how many global conflicts will reach a watershed point on November 5th, because it's not just what happens in the Middle East, but also particularly what happens in Ukraine and in many other parts of the world. So something that we're watching closely, but also the situation in the Middle East, which we'll continue to cover for as long as it goes on. As always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.